They refused to treat Big Shaq's mother, dismissing her like she didn't matter. Big mistake. When Shaquille O'Neal found out, he didn't just get angry, he got even. But instead of revenge, he did something no one saw coming. He built a clinic that would change lives forever. Now the same system that turned her away is begging for survival. This isn't just a story of injustice, it's a story of power, resilience, and a legacy bigger than basketball. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The early afternoon sun cast long shadows over Westgate Private Hospital, one of the most prestigious medical centers in Atlanta. The marble floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the air smelled of antiseptic and wealth. Everything about this place screamed exclusivity, from the silent automatic doors to the receptionists with rehearsed plastic smiles. Lucille O'Neal stepped inside, one hand pressed against her stomach as she winced. The dull ache she had been ignoring for weeks had sharpened overnight, turning into something she could no longer brush off. She had always been tough, always endured pain without complaint, but today was different. She walked slowly to the front desk, adjusting her simple but elegant beige blazer over her shoulders. The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair, looked up, and for a moment, her polite expression faltered. Lucille saw it. The quick up-and-down glance, the silent judgment. "May I help you?" the receptionist asked, her tone neutral but distant. Lucille took a steadying breath. "Yes, I'm here to see a doctor. I haven't been feeling well for a few weeks now, and I think it's time I get checked out." The receptionist's fake smile returned, but there was a stiffness to it. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but—" "We only take walk-ins for urgent cases," the woman interrupted. "You might want to try a community clinic downtown. They're better equipped for general care." Lucille's lips pressed together. She had been through this before, more times than she could count. Too many places, too many faces assuming she didn't belong. "I'd prefer to be seen here," she said, keeping her voice even. "I have insurance, and I can pay out of pocket if necessary." The receptionist hesitated, then forced another smile. "I'll need to check with the doctor on call." Lucille nodded, stepping aside as the woman turned toward the whispering nurses behind her desk. Lucille settled into a chair in the waiting area, ignoring the occasional glances from other patients. Some were subtle, just a quick flick of the eyes before looking away. Others weren't. A middle-aged man in a navy suit eyed her with thinly veiled curiosity, shifting in his seat as if her presence was an intrusion. A younger woman, clutching a designer purse, leaned toward her husband and whispered something. The husband chuckled. Lucille closed her eyes briefly, battling the familiar sting. She had been here before, not just in hospitals, but in restaurants, boutiques, banks, dealerships. The silent questioning of whether she belonged in a space. The irony was almost laughable. If they knew who she was, who her son was, they would be tripping over themselves to offer her the best care available. But Lucille O'Neal had never been the kind of woman to throw her son's name around. She wanted to be treated with dignity because she was a person, not because of who she was connected to. 15 minutes passed. Then 20. Lucille shifted uncomfortably in her chair. The pain had worsened. She considered asking again when a tall, gray-haired man in a white coat approached the front desk. Dr. William Mitchell. Lucille didn't know him, but she recognized the type immediately. Expensive watch, confident stride, the kind of doctor who thrived in places like this, catering to the city's elite. The receptionist gestured toward Lucille, speaking in hushed tones. Dr. Mitchell gave a single glance in her direction, a quick flick of his eyes that lasted less than a second. Then he sighed, shook his head. And just like that, Lucille knew. A minute later, the receptionist returned, her smile even tighter than before. "Dr. Mitchell is very busy today, and unfortunately, he's not taking any additional walk-ins." Lucille frowned. "I've been sitting here for nearly half an hour. There's no one else waiting ahead of me." "I understand," the receptionist said in that same patronizing tone. "But we recommend you visit a clinic that better fits your needs." Lucille exhaled slowly. She knew exactly what that meant. "I don't need a different clinic," she said, voice unwavering. "I need a doctor, I'm experiencing persistent stomach pain. That qualifies as a medical concern, doesn't it? The receptionist shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught between maintaining her polished demeanor and getting Lucille to leave. Mrs. O'Neill, Dr. Mitchell said suddenly, stepping forward. His voice was smooth but detached, the way one might speak to an insistent child. Some discomfort is normal at your age, he continued. Have you considered adjusting your diet? Lucille stared at him. Did he just assume this was about food? I'd like an examination, she said. Not nutrition advice. Dr. Mitchell sighed as if she were asking for something unreasonable. Look, I can prescribe something mild for the pain, but I strongly suggest you visit a clinic where they focus on community health care. That's their specialty. Lucille's stomach twisted, and it wasn't just from the pain. She had good insurance. She could afford specialists, private treatment, anything she needed. But none of that mattered to Dr. Mitchell, who had already decided what kind of patient she was. Let me make sure I understand, Lucille said slowly, keeping her voice steady. I'm standing here in pain, with the ability to pay for your services, but you're refusing to examine me? Dr. Mitchell's smile was thin and dismissive. I just think your needs would be better met elsewhere. Lucille held his gaze, waiting, watching. Dr. Mitchell didn't waver, and that's when she knew he never intended to treat her at all. Lucille walked out of the hospital, her chest tight, not just from the pain but from the anger bubbling beneath it. She wasn't surprised, but that didn't mean it hurt any less. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. The moment Shaq answered, she didn't need to say much. Ma? His voice was warm, relaxed. You good? Lucille hesitated, then exhaled. I need to tell you something. There was a pause on the other end, then a shift in his tone. Tell me everything. That night, Shaq sat at his desk, his fingers drumming against the wood. He had always been a man of calm and control, but tonight, his patience was thin. His mother, his rock, his biggest supporter, had been dismissed like she was nothing. And that wasn't going to slide. Shaq grabbed his phone and dialed a number. Avery, he said when she answered. I need to know everything about a doctor. William Mitchell. Avery Carter, medical student and relentless fighter for justice, knew exactly where this was going. I'm on it, she said. Shaq leaned back in his chair, jaw tight. Westgate Private Hospital had no idea who they had just messed with. And by the time Shaquille O'Neal was done, they were going to wish they had never turned his mother away. Shaquille O'Neal's SUV came to a sharp stop outside Westgate Private Hospital, the tires skidding slightly as he yanked the gear into park. His pulse was steady, but his patience was gone. He threw open the door, stepping out in one fluid motion, his 6'11" frame towering over the sleek black vehicle. Dressed in an all-black fitted suit, he looked less like the basketball legend the world adored, and more like a man on a mission, one that wasn't ending in politeness. The automatic doors slid open, and Shaq strode into the pristine lobby. The moment he entered, the soft hum of murmured conversations cut off abruptly. Patients, nurses, and front desk staff froze in place, heads turning one by one as his presence swallowed the room. The receptionist, the same one who had dismissed his mother just hours earlier, stiffened in her seat. She recognized him immediately, her eyes going wide as if she'd just seen a ghost. Shaq's voice was calm but cold. Where is Dr. Mitchell? The receptionist swallowed hard, her fingers hovering uncertainly over the keyboard. Sir, do you have an appointment? Shaq's jaw clenched. The man was asking if he had an appointment, the same man who had refused to treat his mother. I don't need an appointment, Shaq said, his voice dropping a register. I need answers. Before the receptionist could respond, a set of heavy double doors swung open, and Dr. William Mitchell stepped into the lobby. His expression was unreadable, his expensive watch glinting under the fluorescent lights. He knew why Shaq was here. He didn't care. Shaq turned toward him, his broad shoulders squared, making the room feel smaller in an instant. Dr. Mitchell sighed dramatically and folded his arms. Mr. O'Neill, I assume this is about your mother? The doctor's tone was bored, as if this entire confrontation was nothing more than an inconvenience. Shaq's nostrils flared slightly, but he kept his voice steady, controlled, dangerous. "You assumed she wasn't worth your time," Shaq said, taking a slow step forward. "She was in pain, and you—" Dr. Mitchell held up a hand. "I didn't refuse her treatment." Shaq's eyes darkened. "You told her to go somewhere else," he said, his tone clipped. "You looked at her and decided she wasn't your kind of patient." Dr. Mitchell let out a small, condescending chuckle. "Mr. O'Neill, I make medical recommendations based on what's best for the patient. Your mother would have been better suited at a community clinic that specializes in cases like hers." Shaq's jaw tightened. "Cases like hers?" Dr. Mitchell shrugged. "Lower-income patients, routine care, general practice. Those clinics exist for a reason." The words hit like a slap. A slow, seething rage burned behind Shaq's eyes. But before he could speak, another voice interrupted. "Dr. Mitchell," a deep, authoritative voice called out. "That's enough." A well-groomed man in his mid-60s, dressed in a tailored gray suit, approached with measured confidence. The gold nameplate pinned to his blazer read, "Paul Kensington, Hospital Director." He extended a hand to Shaq, flashing a practiced politician's smile. "Mr. O'Neill," he said smoothly, "I'd like to personally apologize for any inconvenience your mother experienced. Westgate Hospital values all of our patients." Shaq ignored his hand. Kensington's smile barely wavered. He pulled his hand back, clasping it in front of him instead. "Doctor." Mitchell's choice of words was unfortunate, Kensington continued, throwing a sharp look at the doctor. "Rest assured we will look into the matter internally." Shaq let out a slow breath through his nose. "I don't want an internal review," he said. "I want you to tell me, right here, right now, why my mother wasn't treated with respect." Kensington tilted his head slightly, as if considering how to spin the situation. Then, after a pause, he gave a tight-lipped smile. "I'm afraid that's a misunderstanding." Mr. O'Neill. Shaq's fingers curled into fists at his sides. "They weren't going to admit it. They weren't going to take responsibility. This wasn't just one doctor. It was the entire system, a system built to keep people like his mother at arm's length while catering to the wealthy without hesitation. How many other Lucille O'Neills had walked in here and been ignored? How many had left untreated because of silent, calculated discrimination? And how many had never gotten a second chance? A gentle hand touched Shaq's arm. Lucille stood beside him now, her eyes calm but knowing. "Shaquille," she said softly. Shaq turned to her. His mother was the strongest woman he knew, and yet she had been made to feel small in this place. "Arguing won't change anything," she said, her voice steady. "You want to make a difference? Do something real." Shaq swallowed, his breathing slowing. Lucille's eyes held no anger, no resentment, just quiet wisdom, the kind that had always guided him. She was right. Words wouldn't fix this, but actions could. Shaq took one last look at Kensington and Dr. Mitchell, memorizing their smug, indifferent faces. Then he stepped back. "You're right, Ma," he said finally. "This isn't worth my time." Dr. Mitchell smirked, thinking he had won. Shaq met his gaze and smiled, a slow, calculated smile that sent a chill down the doctor's spine. Then, without another word, Shaq turned and walked toward the exit, his mother by his side. As they stepped outside, Shaq pulled out his phone. He scrolled to Avery Carter's number and hit call. "Shaq?" Avery answered after the first ring. "What's up?" Shaq's grip tightened around the phone. "I'm done talking," he said. "It's time to do something real." Avery hesitated, then asked, "What are you thinking?" Shaq's eyes locked onto the Westgate Hospital sign, standing tall and unbothered. "I want to know how deep this problem goes," he said. "I want numbers, statistics, patient stories. I want to know how many people they've turned away." Avery's voice sharpened. "You got it." Shaq exhaled slowly, his anger settling into something more dangerous, determination. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Shaq sat at his desk, his massive hands resting on the smooth mahogany surface, his phone screen glowing in front of him. He had spent his life breaking barriers in basketball, business, and entertainment. But this was different. This was personal. Lucille had raised him to believe in hard work, respect, and fairness, But the reality she had faced at Westgate Private Hospital had nothing to do with any of that. She wasn't turned away because she couldn't pay, wasn't mistreated because she lacked dignity. She was ignored because of who they assumed she was. And Shaq wasn't about to let that slide. He took a deep breath and tapped on his recent calls. Avery Carter, he muttered to himself. He had heard her name before, a young, relentless medical student with a reputation for exposing corruption in healthcare. She was smart, fearless, and most importantly, she knew exactly how the system worked. Shaq hit dial. The phone rang twice before a sharp, confident voice answered. "This is Avery." Shaq leaned forward. "We need to talk." Avery Carter was not easily impressed. She had grown up watching her father, a respected black physician, get passed over for promotions while less experienced white doctors moved ahead. She had seen patients mistreated, ignored, or forced to wait for hours, while others, those with the right look, were ushered into private rooms with first-class care. So when Shaquille O'Neal walked into the cafe to meet her, she wasn't starstruck. She was curious. Shaq sat across from her, his presence commanding but calm. Even in a casual hoodie and jeans, he dominated the space around him. But Avery didn't shrink. She met his gaze head-on. "You're digging into Westgate," she said, getting straight to the point. Shaq nodded. "Yeah." Avery tilted her head. "Why?" Shaq exhaled. "Because they did it to my mom. And if they did it to her, they've done it to others." Avery studied him for a moment, then slid a thick folder across the table. Shaq raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" "Proof," Avery said simply. Shaq opened it, his eyes scanning the documents inside. Patient complaints, internal emails, hidden reports. Page after page of undeniable evidence. "Westgate has been getting away with this for years," Avery explained. Black and Latino patients are 5 times more likely to be dismissed or misdiagnosed. Low-income patients, even the ones with full insurance, are often pushed toward community clinics to keep hospital numbers looking good. Shaq's jaw tightened. Avery leaned in. "And Dr. William Mitchell? He's been at the center of it. Your mom wasn't his first victim." Shaq looked up. "What do you mean?" Avery's expression darkened. "There's something you need to see." Avery pulled out her laptop and clicked on a hidden drive. She turned the screen toward Shaq. "These are recorded patient statements from people who were turned away by Mitchell." Shaq pressed play. The first video loaded. A young black father with tired eyes and a weary voice. "My wife was having complications with her pregnancy. We went to Westgate, but Mitchell barely looked at her. He told us to go to a free clinic. By the time we got there, she had lost too much blood. We lost the baby." Shaq's stomach clenched. The next video, a Latina woman in her 50s. "I had chest pain. Real bad. I told them I had insurance, but Mitchell said it was probably just stress and that I should relax and drink more water. 2 days later, I had a heart attack." Shaq gritted his teeth. The final clip, a teenage girl. "My mom was really sick. She couldn't breathe. They told her it wasn't serious and sent us away. She died at home." Shaq snapped the laptop shut. His hands curled into fists. This wasn't just racism. This was neglect. This was life and death. "They're killing people," he said, his voice dangerously low. Avery nodded. "And no one's holding them accountable." Shaq leaned back, exhaling through his nose. "So, let's change that," he said. That night, Shaq posted a single tweet. "What happens when a system built to heal starts picking who deserves care? Or justice for all? Healthcare corruption." Within minutes, it exploded. News outlets picked up the story. Activists and celebrities started speaking out. Former patients began sharing their stories, and Westgate's reputation started to crack. But then, the retaliation started. 2 days later, Shaq got a call from an unknown number. He answered, expecting a reporter. Instead, a calm but authoritative voice filled the line. "Mr. O'Neal," the man said, "this is Robert Callahan. I'm on the board of directors at Westgate." Shaq leaned back in his chair. "That's supposed to mean something to me?" Callahan chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You've made a lot of noise in the last 48 hours. Shaq said nothing. "You're a respected man, Mr. O'Neal," Callahan continued, You've built an incredible career. It would be a shame if certain partnerships and endorsements started disappearing because of some misguided crusade. Shaq's entire body went still. You trying to threaten me? Callahan's voice remained cool. I'm saying this isn't your fight, and if you're smart, you'll drop it. Shaq smirked. See, that's where you messed up. Callahan paused. Excuse me? You think I need money, Shaq said. I don't. You think I need approval? I don't. But you know what I do need. A world where my mother and people like her get treated like human beings. Silence. Then, Callahan's voice lost its calm. This isn't a battle you want, Mr. O'Neill. Shaq's smile disappeared. Nah, it's exactly the battle I want. He hung up, and that was the moment Westgate knew they had picked the wrong man to silence. Shaq sat on the edge of his couch, scrolling through the dozens of emails, messages, and news alerts that flooded his phone. Since confronting Westgate Private Hospital, the story had spread like wildfire. People were outraged. Some had experienced the same treatment as Lucille, while others were just now realizing how deep the issue ran. His inbox was filled with messages from patients, former employees, and activists, each with their own stories of discrimination and neglect at high-end hospitals. This wasn't just about his mother. This was a systemic issue, and now the world was watching. It was only a matter of time before the media caught on. Shaq received invitations from every major news outlet, but he chose to appear on a show that had a reputation for hard-hitting interviews, The Tate Report. As soon as the interview began, host Malcolm Tate wasted no time. Shaq, you've built a legacy in sports, business, and philanthropy, Tate said, leaning forward. But now, you've stepped into a fight that no one expected. Why? Shaq looked directly into the camera. Because my mother was turned away from a hospital, not because she couldn't pay, not because they were full, but because some doctor decided she wasn't worth treating. And she's not the only one. Tate's expression hardened. You believe this is bigger than Westgate? Shaq nodded. I know it is. And the people reaching out to me? They know it too. Then he pulled out a folder from his lap. This, he said, opening it, is a list of complaints filed against Westgate in the last 5 years. Patients, mostly Black and low income, denied proper care, ignored, or misdiagnosed. The camera zoomed in as Shaq flipped through dozens of testimonies, medical reports, and official complaints that had gone unanswered. And this? He held up a separate stack. These are emails from nurses and doctors who worked there, people who saw this happening but were too scared to speak up. A stunned silence filled the studio. Tate leaned back, shaking his head. That's disturbing. Shaq's voice was calm, but his words carried weight. This isn't about one bad doctor or one bad hospital. This is about a system that treats some lives as more valuable than others. Hours after the interview aired, Westgate Private Hospital finally responded. They released a carefully worded statement on their website and social media. We at Westgate Hospital deeply regret any miscommunication that may have led to Mrs. O'Neill's dissatisfaction with our service. We take these concerns seriously and are reviewing our policies to ensure all patients feel welcomed and valued. Shaq read the weak apology on his phone and let out a humorless laugh. Miscommunication? He muttered under his breath. That's what they're calling it? Avery, who was sitting across from him, rolled her eyes. Classic damage control. They're trying to make it seem like a misunderstanding instead of discrimination. Shaq wasn't buying it, and neither was the public. The backlash was immediate. This isn't an apology. This is PR garbage. So they're just gonna pretend they didn't straight up refuse to treat her? Miscommunication is when you get someone's coffee order wrong. This was racism. People weren't letting this go. And neither was Shaq. Avery spent the next few days digging deeper, reaching out to people who had emailed Shaq. She found former nurses who had quit because they were tired of seeing minority patients treated like second-class citizens. She found patients whose loved ones had suffered irreversible damage due to medical neglect. And then, she found Dr. Samuel Lewis. A former senior physician at Westgate, Dr. Lewis had left the hospital after being pressured to prioritize certain clientele. When Avery called him, he hesitated. I've already said too much. We just need the truth, Avery pressed. We can protect your identity if needed. A long silence. Then, finally, a sigh. "I'll talk," Dr. Lewis said. "But if I do this, I'm putting everything on the line." Avery's grip tightened on the phone. So is Shaq. The next night, Dr. Lewis appeared in a live broadcast, his face partially shadowed to protect his identity. "I worked at Westgate for 10 years, he began, "and I can confirm, minority patients were often deprioritized. We were subtly encouraged to focus on preferred clientele, which basically meant wealthy white patients." Tate, once again leading the interview, narrowed his eyes. "So Lucille O'Neill's experience wasn't an isolated case?" Dr. Lewis shook his head. "Not even close." Shaq watched from his home, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. This was it. Proof. With the hospital under fire, corporate executives began panicking. Shaq started receiving veiled threats. Not direct, but just enough to send a message. Anonymous calls. A cease and desist letter claiming defamation. Hushed warnings that this fight could get messy. None of it worked. If anything, it only made Shaq more determined. A week later, Shaq stood behind a podium at a press conference, cameras flashing around him. He could feel the weight of the moment. He looked out at the crowd, journalists, activists, community leaders. His mother was sitting in the front row, her face calm but proud. Avery stood beside him, arms crossed, her gaze sharp and unwavering. Shaq took a deep breath, then spoke. "I've spent my life breaking barriers," he said. "And now, I'm going to break another one." He let the silence settle, then continued. "If hospitals like Westgate don't want to treat our people with dignity, then we'll build a place that will." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Camera shutters clicked wildly. Shaq's next words sent shockwaves through the city. "I'm investing in a state-of-the-art medical center that will provide quality healthcare to underserved communities, no matter their race, status, or income." Reporters erupted with questions. When will it open? Will this be a nonprofit? Is this in direct retaliation against Westgate? Shaq simply smiled. "This isn't retaliation," he said. "This is justice." That night, as Shaq sat with his mother, she rested her hand on his. "I'm proud of you, son," she said softly. Shaq exhaled, nodding. "This isn't just for you, Ma," he said. "It's for everyone who never got the chance you did." Lucille squeezed his hand. "Then let's make sure they do." The battle wasn't over, but for the first time the system was shaking. The announcement had barely settled before the real battle began. Shaquille O'Neal's plan to build a free state-of-the-art clinic for underserved communities sent shockwaves through the medical establishment. What was meant to be a beacon of hope quickly became a target. Hospitals and private healthcare executives, the same ones who had ignored minority patients for years, weren't happy, and they were going to do everything in their power to stop him. Shaq sat at the head of a large conference table, surrounded by doctors, philanthropists, and activists. Avery Carter sat to his right, flipping through a binder packed with research and financial plans. Across from her was Dr. Elijah Brooks, a well-respected black physician who had worked in both private hospitals and low-income community clinics. Next to him sat Maria Santos, a Latina healthcare activist who had spent years fighting for fair treatment in the system. Shaq leaned forward, his hands clasped. "This isn't just going to be another clinic," he said. "This is going to be a movement, a place where people don't have to beg for basic care." Avery nodded. "And we'll make sure it's fully staffed, fully funded, and impossible to ignore." Dr. Brooks tapped his pen against the table. "I love the vision, Shaq, but you realize what we're up against, right?" Shaq met his gaze without hesitation. "I do." Dr. Brooks sighed. "Hospitals don't want competition, and a free, high-quality clinic? That's more than competition. That's a threat to their entire business model." Maria exhaled. "They'll try to shut us down before we even break ground." Shaq leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "Then we'll make it so big, so undeniable, that they won't be able to stop us." Within weeks, Shaq's team had secured funding from investors, donors, and even a few celebrity philanthropists who believed in the mission. The land was purchased. The blueprints were drawn. The contractors were ready. Then the roadblocks started. First, the building permits were delayed. Then, zoning laws were suddenly reevaluated. stalling construction. Then came the mysterious rejections from medical suppliers. At first, it seemed like a series of unfortunate coincidences, but Shaq and Avery weren't that naive. Avery slammed a thick folder onto Shaq's desk. "They're doing this on purpose." Shaq picked up one of the papers, skimming the legal jargon. "The city's refusing to approve our permits because of a community impact concern." He frowned. "What the hell does that even mean?" Avery crossed her arms. "It means they're making things up to slow us down." Dr. Brooks walked in, shaking his head. "I just spoke with a few friends in the medical field. Word is, some of the big hospital executives are pulling strings behind the scenes. They see this clinic as a direct attack on their profits." Maria let out a bitter laugh. "So now we're a threat just because we want to give people free health care." Shaq tossed the paper onto the desk. His patience was wearing thin. "If they're scared now, wait till we actually open," he muttered. Avery smirked. "Then let's make it happen." Days later, news stations began airing hit pieces on Shaq's project. Anonymous healthcare experts questioned if the clinic was realistic or if it would be safe for patients. One headline read, "Shaquille O'Neal's medical gamble, good intentions or dangerous experiment." On a popular talk show, a hospital executive politely questioned Shaq's qualifications. "I respect Shaquille's philanthropy, but let's be honest. He's not a doctor. Medicine isn't basketball. You can't just build a clinic like you're putting up a gym." Shaq watched the segment from his office, his jaw clenching as he muted the TV. Avery leaned against the desk. "They're trying to discredit you, make people doubt the clinic before we even open." Shaq exhaled. "They really think I'm just going to quit." Dr. Brooks shook his head. "They're underestimating you." Shaq grinned. "Good. That's their first mistake." Just when things couldn't get messier, Shaq received an unexpected phone call. A well-known healthcare executive wanted to meet. When Shaq arrived at the private restaurant, he wasn't surprised to find Howard Langley, the CEO of a major hospital chain, already waiting for him. Langley stood as Shaq approached, extending a hand. "Shaquille, my friend. Good to see you." Shaq didn't shake his hand. He sat down instead. "Let's skip the fake pleasantries. What do you want?" Langley chuckled, taking a sip of his wine. "Straight to business, huh? All right." He leaned forward. "Look, we both know this clinic of yours is disruptive. It's got the wrong people excited and the right people nervous." Shaq said nothing. Langley sighed. "I think we can find a way to work together." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "How?" Langley smiled. "We'll back your clinic, fund it, even put our name on it. In return, we adjust its focus. Maybe charge a little for services. Make it an extension of our network." Shaq's eyes narrowed. "You mean turn it into another private hospital?" Langley lifted his hands. "Call it what you want. But this is the smart move." Shaq leaned back, crossing his arms. "You really think I built my entire career just to sell out the second things got tough?" Langley's smile faltered. "I'm offering you an easy way out." Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. Then he stood up. "You think I need an easy way out?" He towered over Langley now. "I'm Shaquille O'Neal. I don't back down. I build things that last." Langley's face turned red. "You're making a mistake." Shaq smirked. "No, I just stopped listening to guys like you." Then, without another word, he walked out. Back at the construction site, the first beams of Lucille Medical Center were finally being placed. Shaq stood beside Avery, Maria, and Dr. Brooks, watching as the foundation was laid. Avery turned to him. "Think they'll keep trying to stop us?" Shaq smirked. "No doubt." Maria sighed. "They've got money, connections, power." Shaq folded his arms as the sun set over the site. "So do we," he said. "And we're just getting started." The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, they were winning. The Lucille Medical Center was weeks away from opening. The walls were up, the equipment was being installed, and the final pieces of Shaq's vision were falling into place. The dream was becoming real. And then, it all came crashing down. Shaq was in his office when the first news alert popped up on his phone. "Breaking. Former partner speaks out against Shaquille O'Neal's controversial medical clinic." His stomach sank. He tapped the link, and a video began playing. There, sitting across from a well-known news anchor, was Dr. Terrence Evans, one of the most respected members of their team, a man Shaq had trusted. Shaq leaned forward, eyes narrowing as Evans began to speak. "I had to step away from the project," Evans said, shaking his head. "I realized that Shaquille O'Neal, while well-intentioned, is not a medical professional. He has no experience running a clinic, and the truth is, this entire operation is dangerous." Shaq's fingers curled into a fist. The anchor nodded, feigning concern. "So you believe this clinic poses a risk to patients?" Evans sighed dramatically. "Absolutely. There's no oversight, no regulation, and no guarantee that these patients will receive safe treatment." Shaq couldn't believe what he was hearing. The man he had trusted, the man who had stood beside him in this fight, was now tearing it all down. And worse, people were believing him. Within hours, the internet exploded. News channels ran headlines like, "Shaq's medical gamble, a disaster waiting to happen." "Healthcare expert warns against O'Neal's unlicensed clinic." "Is this a billionaire's vanity project gone wrong?" On social media, opinions were divided. "I knew this was a bad idea. Shaq's great, but he's not a doctor. If medical professionals are saying it's unsafe, maybe we should listen. They're just trying to ruin him. This is a setup." Sponsors started backing out. Investors were getting cold feet. Shaq's phone rang nonstop. Lawyers, advisors, reporters demanding statements. And then came the worst call of all. Avery Carter's voice was sharp and furious when Shaq answered. "It's a setup," she said without hesitation. Shaq exhaled. "I know." "No, you don't," she snapped. "I just got off the phone with one of my sources. Evans was paid off." Shaq stiffened. "By who?" Avery didn't hesitate. "Westgate Hospital's board." Silence. Then Shaq's jaw clenched. "You're sure?" Avery's voice was dead serious. "They wired $2.5 million into Evans's personal account 3 days ago. The money came from a shell company linked to one of Westgate's top executives." Shaq ran a hand over his face. "They bought him," he muttered. "They bought his loyalty." Shaq wasn't one for public rants. He had built his reputation on staying calm, handling business, and letting his actions speak louder than words. But this was war. That night, Shaq went live on national television. Sitting across from the same anchor who had interviewed Evans, he kept his voice steady, but firm. "Dr. Evans was my friend," he said. "I trusted him. I respected him. And then, he took millions of dollars from the same people who have been trying to destroy this clinic from the beginning." The anchor shifted uncomfortably. "Do you have proof of that?" Shaq nodded. "I do." And then, he dropped the bombshell. Live on air, Shaq's legal team presented the financial records, the wire transfers, the shell company, the connection to Westgate Hospital. The anchor's face paled. "So what you're saying is, this was a coordinated attack?" Shaq folded his hands together. "This wasn't about safety. This was about power." Within hours, Westgate Hospital went into damage control. They issued a statement denying everything. Westgate Hospital has no involvement in the actions of Dr. Evans. Any claims suggesting otherwise are baseless and defamatory. But the public wasn't buying it. A whistleblower, a former hospital executive, came forward, confirming that Westgate had been trying to sabotage Shaq's clinic for months. Social media flipped. "Shaq's receipts are solid. Westgate is guilty as hell. They tried to pay off a doctor to lie. How many other doctors have they bought? This is corruption at the highest level." Westgate was cornered. And Shaq? He wasn't done yet. Despite the smear campaign, the lost investors, the legal threats, Shaq refused to back down. 1 week later, construction resumed. Lucille Medical Center was back on track. Avery stood beside Shaq as they looked out at the nearly completed building. The fight had been brutal, but they had won. "They threw everything at us," Avery said, "and we're still standing." Shaq nodded. "Because this was never about them." He turned to look at his mother, standing near the entrance, her eyes filled with quiet pride. This was always about her. Lucille looked at him and smiled. "You did good, son," she said softly. Real good. And as Shaq looked at the clinic that would change thousands of lives, he knew. The battle wasn't over. But the war, they were winning. Shaq had faced every challenge, every attack, every roadblock, but nothing rattled him like this. His mother, his rock, his guiding force, was sick again. Lucille had never been the type to complain. Even when she was hurting, she brushed it off with a wave of her hand and that quiet, knowing smile. But Shaq knew her too well. And today, as she sat at the breakfast table, pushing her food around her plate, something was wrong. Shaq leaned forward, his eyes scanning her face. She looked tired, not just the usual wear of age, but something deeper. Her normally radiant brown skin looked pale, her movements slower than usual. "Ma," he said gently. "You okay?" Lucille smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine, baby. Just a little off today." Shaq wasn't convinced. Avery, sitting across from them, studied Lucille carefully. "You sure, Mrs. O'Neill? You've barely touched your food." Lucille exhaled. "I've just been feeling a little weak these past few days. Probably nothing." Shaq's stomach tightened. He had heard those words before. The last time they had nearly cost her everything, and he wasn't making that mistake again. Shaq stood up. "We're getting you checked out." Lucille waved a dismissive hand. "I don't need a doctor fussing over me. I just need rest." Avery leaned in. "Mrs. O'Neill, it won't hurt to get looked at. And besides, we have the perfect place now." Lucille blinked. And then it hit her. She didn't have to fight for dignity at Westgate anymore. She didn't have to sit in a waiting room while doctors decided if she was worth their time. She had a place of her own now. A place where she mattered. The moment Shaq and Lucille walked through the glass doors of Lucille Medical Center, the atmosphere was completely different. Instead of skeptical glances, she was greeted with warmth. A nurse, a young black woman in navy scrubs, smiled as they approached. "Good morning, Mrs. O'Neill," she said cheerfully. "We've been expecting you." Lucille raised an eyebrow. "Expecting me?" Shaq smirked. "I called ahead." The nurse led them into an exam room, where Dr. Elijah Brooks entered moments later. His expression wasn't dismissive or impatient. It was focused and professional. "Mrs. O'Neill," he said warmly, "I heard you weren't feeling like yourself. Let's figure out what's going on, okay?" Lucille exhaled, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "Okay." Dr. Brooks listened, actually listened, as Lucille described her symptoms. He asked follow-up questions, made notes, and assured her they would run tests just to be safe. Shaq sat beside her, watching everything. He knew this was how it was supposed to be. Not rushed, not dismissed, just care. An hour later, Dr. Brooks returned with the results. "Mild anemia," he said. "Nothing serious, but it explains the fatigue. We'll adjust your diet, get you on a supplement, and have you feeling like yourself again in no time." Lucille nodded, relieved. "That's all it is?" Dr. Brooks smiled. "That's all. And we'll keep checking in, just to be sure." Lucille looked at Shaq, her eyes shining with something he hadn't seen in a long time. Peace. As Shaq walked his mother out of the clinic, a woman approached him. She was middle-aged, dressed in a modest coat, her hands trembling slightly. "Mr. O'Neill?" she said hesitantly. Shaq turned to her, offering a kind smile. "Yes, ma'am?" The woman took a shaky breath. "I just wanted to say thank you." Shaq frowned. "For what?" She swallowed hard. "For this place. For giving us a place." She gestured toward the clinic's waiting room, where people of all backgrounds sat comfortably, receiving care without fear or judgment. Shaq felt his throat tighten. This was never just about his mother. It was about all of them. As news of Lucille's treatment at her own medical center spread, the media latched onto the moment. Headlines read, "From rejection to revolution, Shaq's clinic changes the game." Lucille O'Neill finds care in a system that once ignored her. What if every hospital worked like this? The public response was overwhelming. Shaq just did what the healthcare system refuses to do: treat people with dignity. This isn't just a clinic, it's a movement. Why aren't all hospitals run like this? Even those who had doubted him before were now paying attention. Westgate Private Hospital? They stayed silent. That night, Shaq and Lucille sat on the back patio of his house, watching the sky turn deep orange and purple. Lucille took a slow sip of her tea. You know, when I was sitting in that exam room today, I realized something. Shaq turned to her. What's that? She smiled softly. I finally felt like I belonged. Shaq's chest ached. Lucille had spent her entire life working, sacrificing, pushing through barriers. And today was the first time she had walked into a clinic and felt like she was supposed to be there. Shaq reached over, squeezing her hand. You always did, Ma, he said. They just needed to catch up. Lucille chuckled, shaking her head. Stubborn, just like your father. Shaq grinned. I learned from the best. They sat there watching the sky, knowing that this wasn't just an ending, it was a beginning. A beginning for everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. A beginning for a new kind of healthcare, a beginning that would change lives forever. Westgate Private Hospital had survived decades of quiet discrimination. Until now. For years, they had operated under the radar, prioritizing wealthy patients while dismissing those they deemed unprofitable. But after Lucille O'Neill's experience, Shaq's fight, and the unveiling of a corrupt system, the hospital was no longer untouchable. Its past had finally caught up. The walls of Westgate's administration office were closing in. Paul Kensington, the hospital director, sat at his desk, scrolling through the endless flood of negative headlines. Lawsuit filed against Westgate Hospital. Discrimination exposed. Former patients speak out, we were denied care. Medical neglect or racism. Investigations underway. Lawsuits had been filed. Whistleblowers had come forward. Westgate's name was ruined. Kensington looked up as Dr. William Mitchell, the doctor who had refused to treat Lucille, walked in. We have a problem, Mitchell said, his voice tight. Kensington let out a bitter laugh. You think? Mitchell threw a legal document onto the desk. A class action lawsuit. Hundreds of patients are suing us. Kensington's face darkened. How many? Mitchell exhaled. Too many. The lawsuit wasn't just about Lucille O'Neill. It was about every person Westgate had ignored, dismissed, and mistreated. And now, they all wanted justice. The first real casualty of the scandal came a week later. Dr. Mitchell, once a respected figure at Westgate, was forced to resign. The hospital tried to quietly let him go, but the press caught on. Cameras flashed as Mitchell walked out of the hospital for the last time, his coat draped over one arm, his face tight with thinly disguised anger. Reporters swarmed him. Dr. Mitchell, do you regret your actions? Did you deny treatment to other minority patients? Do you believe Westgate is a racist institution? Mitchell ignored them all, pushing past the crowd. But the damage was done. He had built his career on reputation and connections. Now he had neither. While Westgate scrambled to do damage control, Avery Carter was doing the opposite. She was leaning into the fight. Her inbox was overflowing with messages from patients who had been wronged. An elderly black man whose wife had been misdiagnosed. A young Latina mother who was ignored during labor and nearly lost her child. A former nurse who was told to deprioritize certain patients. Avery wasn't just listening, she was building cases. She sat across from a group of lawyers, flipping through medical records and testimonies. We're not just filing one case, she said. We're filing all of them. One of the lawyers hesitated. This is going to take years, Avery. Hospitals like Westgate don't go down easy. Avery's gaze hardened. Neither do I. Through it all, the world waited for Shaq's response. The media wanted a reaction. They wanted him to gloat, celebrate, tear Westgate apart. But Shaq? He stayed silent. Instead of talking about Westgate's downfall, he kept the focus on Lucille Medical Center. Interviews, fundraisers, expansions. Every move he made was about building something bigger. One reporter finally caught up with him outside an event. Shaq, do you have anything to say about Dr. Mitchell's resignation? Shaq paused. The cameras leaned in. Finally, he said, I'm not here to celebrate another man's downfall. I'm here to celebrate the people we're lifting up. And with that, he walked away. With lawsuits piling up and public trust shattered, Westgate tried one last move. They released a heavily produced commercial showing smiling doctors, diverse patients, and a scripted apology from the new hospital CEO. We at Westgate Hospital recognize the mistakes of the past. We are committed to rebuilding trust and ensuring quality care for all. It was too little, too late. The people had already chosen. Westgate was the past. Lucille Medical Center was the future. 1 year later, Shaq stood in front of a crowd of thousands at the grand opening of a second Lucille Medical Center. The first location had been so successful, so impactful, that expansion was inevitable. Lucille, standing beside him, squeezed his hand. "You did it, son," she whispered. Shaq smiled. "We did." As he looked out at the crowd, families, nurses, doctors, activists, he realized something. This had started as a fight, but now it was a movement, and they weren't done yet. The morning air was crisp as Shaquille O'Neal stepped onto the stage, looking out at the thousands of people gathered in front of Lucille Medical Center's newest location. The energy in the crowd was electric, not just from the cameras flashing or the cheers that filled the air, but from the undeniable feeling that history was being made. Shaq adjusted the mic, his massive hands steady, but his heart full. This wasn't just another ribbon-cutting ceremony. This was a revolution. 1 year ago, Westgate Private Hospital had tried to bury the truth. 1 year ago, his mother had been denied care because of prejudice. 1 year ago, Lucille Medical Center was just a dream. And today, that dream had become a force of change so powerful that it couldn't be ignored. Shaq exhaled, gripping the podium as he scanned the faces in the crowd. Families, doctors, nurses, activists, people who had once been forgotten by the system, but were now at the center of something bigger. He leaned into the mic. 1 year ago, we opened the doors to the first Lucille Medical Center. The crowd cheered. It wasn't about business. It wasn't about making headlines. It was about one thing: giving people the care they deserve. The cheers grew louder. Shaq smiled. And now, it's time to take that mission even further. The audience went silent, waiting, hanging on to every word. Shaq took a breath, then dropped the news that would change everything. Starting today, we're expanding Lucille Medical Center across the country. The crowd erupted. Multiple locations, more cities, more communities, more lives saved. Lucille, standing in the front row, covered her mouth, her eyes shining with pure pride. Avery Carter, now in her new white doctor's coat, grinned as she stood beside the other physicians who had fought alongside Shaq. The moment was bigger than any game-winning shot, bigger than any championship. This was real victory. After the event, Shaq found Avery standing by the entrance of the new clinic, watching the patients being welcomed inside. She looked different now, stronger, more certain. She wasn't just a medical student anymore. She was Dr. Avery Carter. Shaq clapped a hand on her shoulder. "Proud of you, Doc." Avery smirked. "You should be. You're looking at the new director of operations for Lucille Medical Center." Shaq's brows lifted. "Damn, I take a little credit for that." Avery crossed her arms. "You should, but you better not slow down now." Shaq chuckled. "Not a chance." She glanced at the crowd, her expression turning serious. "This place, it's not just a clinic, Shaq. It's hope." Shaq nodded. "And we're just getting started." Later that evening, Lucille sat in the passenger seat of her sleek black Rolls-Royce, watching as the city lights blurred past. Shaq was driving, one hand on the wheel, the other tapping against the dashboard. He glanced at her. "You good, Ma?" Lucille didn't answer right away, because as they drove, they passed a familiar building. Westgate Private Hospital, the place that had once shut its doors in her face. She stared at it for a long moment, then exhaled. "I never thought I'd see the day," she murmured. Shaq looked over. "What day?" Lucille smiled softly. "The day I didn't feel like a victim anymore." Shaq gripped the wheel a little tighter. "You were never a victim, Ma," he said. "They just didn't know who they were messing with." Lucille turned to her son, the boy she had raised on faith, resilience, and love. "And now?" He had taken those lessons and changed the world with them. As they pulled up to the house, Shaq turned off the engine and sat back, looking up at the stars. Lucille patted his hand. You know, people will remember you for a lot of things. Shaq smirked. Yeah? Like what? She chuckled. Basketball, business, being the biggest damn human in every room you walk into. Shaq laughed. Not my fault I was born this way. Lucille's smile softened. But this? She gestured toward the city, toward the clinics, toward the lives he had saved. This is what they'll remember most. Shaq's throat tightened. Lucille squeezed his hand. You've always been more than my son. He turned to her, his chest aching at the love in her eyes. You're my inspiration. Shaq exhaled, staring at her for a long moment before nodding. Right back at you, Ma. The fight wasn't over. There were still barriers to break, lives to change, and systems to fix. But Shaquille O'Neal had proven one thing. Power wasn't about money. It wasn't about fame. It was about what you did with it, and he had chosen to change the world. Injustice thrives when we stay silent, but change happens when we take action. Shaq didn't wait for the system to fix itself. He built something better. Now, it's our turn. Support businesses that stand for fairness, demand accountability, and fight for healthcare that serves everyone. Share this story, start the conversation, and be part of the movement. Because when we stand together, we don't just change lives, we change the world.